So welcome everyone, both in person and on Zoom, to our inaugural genealogy event. And we have a couple joiners here. Please take one of each. There's a handout and a presentation. I wanted to introduce myself and my partner who will be going over this presentation with you tonight. My name is Jeremy Lehman, and I've lived in White Plains now for about 6.5 years. And over the past 4 years, I've gotten really passionate about genealogy research. And hopefully, the goal of tonight is to provide an introduction to genealogy research and to empower you all to feel like you can do this too. And because I firmly believe that that everyone can make discoveries in their own ancestry, and they can do it all from the comforts of their own home. Okay. And
hi.
And we're going to have Eliza here introduce herself too.
Hi, I'm Eliza Wasserman. And for some time, I've been interested in genealogy. So we are talking to the Zoom and the crowd here. I discovered a lot about who I am. I have a long history in genealogy. Since I was about 20 years old, I've been doing genealogy, so about more than a decade. And we'll leave it there. And I'm happy to be here tonight working with Jeremy and sharing one of our passions that we have.
And so before we get started, a couple things. One is that in the chat, Shara Goldman is going to be sharing a link to the presentation where you can download it onto your computer, as well as a handout. And I highly encourage you to download both of these links. The handout has all these wonderful links to get you started with genealogy research. The second thing is we're going to hold off on questions until after we give the presentation. We expect that to be about 45 minutes or so. And after that, we'll be happy to take any questions that you have. In the meantime, if you do have questions that pop up, write them in the chat, and so that you don't forget them. And with that, I think we will get started. All right. You want to get started with the first slide here?
Yeah, so basically genealogy, as many of you might be familiar with it, is really just studying your lineage and your family from across different generations. It's learning about history through that special lens of you, right?
Yeah, and just to make a finer point on it, family history is more of a broader term, and it has a broader emphasis on ancestors' life stories. So when we talk about genealogy, it's a lot about the documents and trying to trace your families and your extended families. And then family history is sort of the color, the stories that are behind it. And so genealogy is the bare bones, and you can build off of that. And what I try and do with my own genealogy presentations is provide as much family history as possible built off of the genealogy.
Oh, so
oh, you know what? Let me just hold on, guys. I have the wrong thing.
It's okay. So it's just that one. Oh, it's the other slide.
Too, yeah. Hold on just a second, guys. I will link to a different presentation that I got open. Just a sec. All right.
There it is.
Yep. All right. And here we go.
Great. Thank you. So I like to think about genealogy research as this game maybe you're familiar with is called Minesweeper. Sometimes you hit the square and you reveal like a large portion of information, and sometimes you literally just reveal that one square. And it's part of the fun of genealogy, right? It's like not knowing, what it's going to lead to. So I think it's just a great way to kind of approach it. Is you just never know what you're going to learn on each one of those kind of moves or steps that you make.
Yeah, and genealogy is all about problem solving. So if you are someone who loves puzzles, you love doing crosswords, anything like that, you're constantly solving puzzles with genealogy. It's one of the best parts about it. And again, it's about, seeing history through a personal lens. You read about, history in the textbooks, but, when you do your own genealogy, you can see that history played out with the lives of your ancestors. There's nothing more incredible than that. And then just finally here, genealogy is the best way to connect with relatives. I have been able to form connections with people living all over the world And it's been really, really special to connect with people across the world. So with that, let's go to the next slide.
So this is a really important piece. When you are studying your genealogy, we are who we choose to be. And there are things that you can uncover in your past that might be amazing, right? You might find out that you come from this great rabbinic line, or that you're part of some sort of royalty from a different country. You may also find things that make you feel uncomfortable, right? That maybe your family was slave owners, or that an affair had happened in your family. Either way, no matter what you find in your genealogy research, is that you are who you choose to be, and your identity is what you identify with. So with that, right, it's a important piece. Building a tree. So I just love this. So when I got started in genealogy, I was 20 years old, and unfortunately my grandmother had passed away. And I had brought a prop to show you, because this is what I was left with. You may have seen copier boxes like this. This is filled with photos.
Oh,
It's filled with photos of people I had no idea who they were. And my mother didn't either. It turns out that was our Jewish family. And I didn't know any of them. I didn't even know I was Jewish when I was 20. And so I started literally on pen and paper. So if anything, you can always start just by writing it down. It's really important just to start somewhere. If you get overwhelmed by the technology, if you get overwhelmed by the choices and the links, it's okay. This folds out literally like a map. When this got too big, then I was kind of forced to jump into an online system to organize my family research. But this is how I started, because the most important thing you can give to your children is the research that you did. And so no matter how you've written it down, leaving a box of unidentified photos was a really large project for me to go through. And if anything you can do, any birth certificates, marriage certificates, anything from the here and now that you have, it's a lot easier for you to get them than it will be for generations down the line to get them.
Yes. And when you're building your tree, there are two important aspects to it. The first is what you traditionally think about when you're building back a tree is, let's go back in time. Let's see how far back in time I can take my tree. But it's also very important to build it laterally. And that's what's shown in Eliza's tree, and also what we have here on the slide. Being able to look at siblings and cousins and extended cousins and building out the tree to the present day. And so here on this example is an ancestor of mine who lived in the 19th century. And guess what? She had a lot of siblings who all had lots of children. And so it can get very complicated early on, when you're building these extensive trees. And so online trees is a way to simplify the process. There are a few different providers of online trees. The biggest ones are Ancestry and MyHeritage, and Eliza has used Genealogy Online, which is focused, it's a website in the Netherlands. And the advantage of having an online tree is that it can be public, and others' cousins can find your tree, can find you, and can get in touch with you. So my tree personally is on Ancestry, and I have ported it to MyHeritage, but my main tree is on Ancestry.
Extract the data.
Yeah, it's on the handout.
Say that again?
You can't extract the data from MyHeritage for the Ancestry.
Oh, correct. So he was asking, can you transfer online trees? And it's very easy. There's a format for trees called GEDCOMs, and you can download a tree from MyHeritage and instantly upload to Ancestry. It's very easy. No.
And what's the point where you think you're done? Can you port it for these offline products?
Yeah, so I want to get into the offline too. So you can at any point port to an offline as well. And there are offline software programs. Let's say you want to have it on your computer and just on your computer. You don't want to have it online. There are other services that you can use. The one that I use is Family Tree Maker. You can make a lot of interesting charts and trees with it. But there's also, and that one you have to pay a fee for, but there's also Roots Magic. And what I would say about just this slide, We have a handout that has all of these sites on there. It looks like this. A link is going to be posted in the chat, and you can find all of these links to Family Tree Maker, to Ancestry, MyHeritage, all of that. And a lot of the content that we're going to be discussing is all in this handout that's supplemental to the presentation. All right.
Yes. So starting with number one, identify what you already know about your family. That goes back to the box that I just shared with you, is that what do you know, right? What pictures do you have? If you had to pick one picture, right, of your parents or your grandparents to put in this project to live on, what picture would that be? Right? So start thinking about that. We take lots of pictures today, hundreds, thousands of pictures, right? Our phones are filled with them. But what if you could only have one? What would that look like? So start thinking about the here and now, your family, and start bringing together that information.
Yeah, so you want to know about what parts of your family you want to focus on. It can be overwhelming at first to try and think about all the different lines of ancestry. What I usually recommend is focus on a single line and build that out first, and then you can go to an adjacent line. Another resource before you start like researching on your own is you can find other people who have also researched your family beforehand. So there are a lot of online trees, as I mentioned. You can find your family there. I have found some of the people whose families who posted their surnames before this event. There are trees available where you have some of your ancestors already online, and you can search for them, and you can do all of that too. So after you talk to family, after you do this initial just surveying of other trees, then you can get started with your own research with trying to find your roots. So let's go on to the next slide. So I wanted to spend a few moments just to talk about what are the different types of genealogy records that you can find in this research. So there are a lot that are, and again, a lot of these are available online that you can find for free, depending on the locality and the time and the place. But what are the types of records? So the first one is probably the most important, and they're called vital records. Vital records are birth records, marriage records, and death records. So you know, birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, and those are very important because marriages will oftentimes list, you know, the groom and the bride's parents. You can have extended family members listed on that. Obviously, a birth record will also list the parents. You might also have places of birth where the parents were from. You get a lot of very useful information from vital records. They are a core part of genealogy records. A second one that's also core is census records. Those are most pertinent to the United States, where there are census taken every 10 years. The same thing in the UK. There are records taken every 10 years. And depending on the locality, you could have census taken in places in Europe too. And again, a lot of this stuff is available online. The third one, passenger arrival records. They're pretty important. You can find immigration records for your ancestors arriving in America or arriving in other countries. Naturalization records. So when they became citizens, they would need to get, this is usually in America, men prior to 1940, but men would get naturalized and their wives would get naturalized as part of their husband. And so those are important records because they will also list hometowns. You can use city business directories. A lot of this is available online. Military service records if they served in the military, property records, school records. And I think what's very important for Jewish genealogy, cemetery records and grave photos, and we will talk about that. But I just we have pictures here on the slide just of examples of vital records. So this is one from both of our families. All right. So we've talked about what are the different types of genealogy records. The next question is, where can we find these genealogy records? The unfortunate thing is there isn't a one-stop shop. There isn't one place you can go to where you can find all your information and build out your tree right away. So that is why we have this handout that people in the room are holding and hopefully got posted to the chat, where we have a lot of links to get you started, depending on where your ancestry is from. Again, this is the handout.
So I'll just jump in and just go over those sections real quickly. The family tree. So those are places where you might want to organize your information. And then you have general and regional for depending on where your family may be from, what type of research you're going to be doing, newspaper, Holocaust, grave research, DNA, and also where can you get help if you do get stuck, right? Like your records are all in Dutch. What do you do to get through that?
You can also ask us too.
Yeah.
We're also a resource. We didn't list it on the sheet, but we can also be a resource. So what are some of the best general genealogy research websites that are on here too? Family Search. Family Search is what I recommend to everyone because it's free. It's run by the Mormon Church. The Mormons are very much into genealogy, and they have so many records available for free. You just have to create a username and password. Highly, highly recommend. They've got so many resources available. The second one are paid subscriptions that I also highly recommend. Ancestry or MyHeritage. I don't think you need to have both, but they have a lot of data. Ancestry is focused more on the United States. So you can get so many different records, even like book photos of people who are alive today. You can find that on Ancestry. MyHeritage is more European focused. And so depending on where you're researching, you might want to have a subscription to one of those. Newspapers.com has a lot of English-based newspapers that you can research. So if your family was, written up in a newspaper somewhere in the United States for the last 100 years, you could find that. For instance, it's also for anywhere that was English speaking. So I have a third great grandfather who was arrested for stealing jewelry in England in 1850, and his whole trial is out on the newspapers all over there, and I found it on newspapers.com. Okay.
Did you know this previously?
No, not at all. Not at all. He was convicted too. All right. And the last one is Jewish Gen. That is the main.
Are you saying, because most of our ancestors came from Europe, you're saying you really need both programs if the one is concentrated on the U.S.?
What I would say to
did
get.
some, I got to a certain point, but then it was in Cyrillic and Ukraine. So you're saying that the second one really deals.
These are general websites, so I should clarify. He's asking, should I be subscribing to MyHeritage if I'm trying to research my European records? And the answer is no. There are specific websites for Ukraine, for Russia, for Latvia that I have in the handout that are better suited for specific regional research. This is for general research. If most of your family lives in Europe today or lives in Israel, then maybe MyHeritage makes sense. If most of your family today lives in America, you should use Ancestry. All right, and I wanted to go to the next slide here because this is a very important development just in the past 12 months. New York City municipal archives have started digitizing their vital records, and they're available online for free. Okay, so I'm assuming a lot of people here do have ancestors that lived in New York City in the 5 boroughs. You can find birth records, marriage records, and death records very easily using their portal. So I have a link here in the presentation. It is also found in the handout, and it's really amazing. You can get the actual document. You can download it as a PDF. And again, you can get records. The death records go through 1948, so it's not that long ago. So, all right. So now we're going to get into the meat of the presentation here. And this is something that what I have found are the biggest hurdles with researching Ashkenazi Jewish genealogy. So I want to go over each hurdle and talk about it briefly and talk about some tips that I have and Elisa has about how we can approach these problems, because they are serious problems with dealing with Ashkenazi Jewish genealogy. So what are they? The first one is determining the names our family members used in Europe. Okay. And we're going to talk about that because the names in Europe oftentimes are very different names than the names they used in America or in other English-speaking countries. Number 2 is, and this is a really hard one, finding the places in Europe where your ancestors came from. That is very, very difficult. And we'll talk about that. The third is finding records in Europe for your ancestors. And the last one is going beyond the surname adoption barrier. We will talk about all of these, but I just wanted to preview it here on this slide. All right, so on this slide here, we're going to be talking about names. The first hurdle that a lot of people have with researching Jewish genealogy is finding their ancestors' names because their names are different than what they later used in America. So many immigrants Americanized their first names, and some even changed their last names after they came to America. It's a myth that names were changed on Ellis Island. No names were changed at Ellis Island.
Ellis Island makes that very clear. It's a terrible myth.
It is a terrible myth. No one changed, and all the evidence I've seen in my own genealogy, that's the case. No one changed their names on Ellis Island, but people did do that afterwards. And for some good reasons, some bad reasons too. I mean, like, like for instance, I just for a last name change, because I'm going to talk mostly about first names. My wife has a line in her family that's today is Roberts. Before Roberts, in America, it was Rubenstein. But guess what? In Europe, it was Rabinovitz. That is very, very difficult to trace all those lines and figure out all those surname changes. So that's very, very difficult. But I want to focus more on the first names because a lot of times there will be Yiddish names that were used in Europe that became Americanized. So I have here examples of both men and women that names that are typical, but there are a lot more examples. So for instance, Leib became Lewis, Moshe became Morris, Ashia, which is Yehoshua or Joshua, that became Oscar. For female names, Shandel became Jenny, Henna became Helena, Vega became Fanny. These are ones that I've seen all the time in my tree. And what I have here on my right-hand side, on the right-hand side of this presentation are my second great-grandparents and their grave. They were Jenny and Lewis, but their Yiddish names, as you can read on the grave, we can get Hebrew names from graves, were Shandel Leah, and Yehuda Leib. Leib can sometimes be Yehuda Leib. It can also be Arya Leib. So what I give as tips are, number one, find a picture of the grave of the individual to learn their Hebrew Yiddish names. If you can find a picture of their grave, that will go a very long way. Second tip, find their U.S. arrival records, because if you can find their arrival records, they will have arrived with their Yiddish name. They will not have had their Americanized name. Number three, know some of the common Hebrew Yiddish combination names. So when we talk about Hebrew Yiddish combination names, that's like Menachem Mendel or Dov Ber. They actually mean the same thing, but one is in Hebrew. The first word is in Hebrew. The second word is in Yiddish, okay? And you see a lot of these combinations together. And then the most important tip for getting names is be flexible, okay? Spelling was much more fluid 100 plus years ago, and there could be multiple variations to a name. So play around with spellings of names, be as open-minded as possible as you do your research.
And I'll just jump in on the names here, is that sometimes there was marriages within families, which can also complicate whether or not you're finding a different, like people from two different lines. Sometimes maybe somebody passed away in the family and was married into and someone else in the family undertook the family. And to move into the next slide, sometimes different families also live together. So that'll be in the next.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's actually a very good, important point. If any of your ancestors also came from Galicia, this is specific to Galicia, southern Poland, you may have an added hurdle. And that is that, especially in the later half of the 1800s, if people did not get a legal marriage, which meant they had to pay a lot of money, if they didn't do that, then their children inherited their mother's surname. So there are instances where the mother's surname gets inherited. It's specific to areas of southern Poland. So surnames also can be fluid too.
Legal marriage, you mean a civil ceremony?
It wasn't a civil ceremony. It was for tax purposes. There was also a secular component too, where they had to like do some education that they had to prove, but it was also money. They had to pay money too.
Can I ask you a question about the spellings? Right, so my grandmother is a Harkavi. We have also found things Garharka or whatever.
Russia?
And Garkawe, like there's some letters.
G and H are interchangeable in
Right,
Russian.
So there's a
So
bunch of things
there are
like
lots of
that.
different ways to do
Is there
that.
a list of that?
No, I have not put together a list of that. It's very regional dependent. So it depends on where your ancestors live. Like the G and H is not interdependent, it's not like that outside of Russian lands, but it is for Russian lands. But when you do some of these searches on some of these websites, you can use very broad terms to be like phonetically or sounds like it, and it will pick up on
It
those
will?
GH stuff. Yeah. Okay, so the next big hurdle are places, and this is a really tough one. And I struggle with this, certainly a lot with my research, is trying to find the places in Europe. And when I say places, I mean specific towns that your ancestors were living in. So, and that's a really big challenge. And I will caveat this and say, people didn't just live in one place for hundreds of years. Oftentimes they did move around between different towns. There are cases where people just stayed put and the families were there for a couple hundred years, but that's more of the anomaly. So you sometimes will be tracing families across various towns. But to get you started, how can you get through this hurdle? The first one is always ask relatives who might be able to help you, if that's available to you. Ask relatives who might know where your ancestors came from. Yeah, that's where the buck stops here. Yeah. So the second one, if you don't have any relatives to ask, or you've exhausted that, look at U.S. naturalization records. Now, again, I mentioned those are only really found for men, but if you have males in the family that immigrated, they will usually indicate the specific town that they came from. If not, they will say the region of the country that they came from, so you can get sort of close. Third one, find their U.S. arrival record. If they arrived, especially after 1900, it will oftentimes list the town they were coming from. If you came in the late 1800s or earlier, it's going to be harder to find from the U.S. arrival record. But this is the real one that I found that's been super helpful for me. If you have a family that immigrated from the port of Hamburg, you are extraordinarily lucky, because all of the departure records from all these different ports in Europe were destroyed, because people didn't care about immigrants leaving their country and going to America. But Hamburg decided to maintain it. And on the Hamburg records, on the departure records, it lists the exact town that everyone is from, all the immigrants are from. So you can actually see them leave Hamburg. You can see them arrive in America or other places. You can easily, if you know that they left from Hamburg, you will find the town of your ancestors. And so
the Germans burnt people, but they didn't burn paper.
they didn't. We'll talk about that with that.
Because my great grandparents left Hamburg in 87.
Ancestry.
Uh,
Ancestry is the best place. A subscription to Ancestry will get you that. All the Hamburg records. That's a very important case for Ancestry. That's a good question. So he's asking, how can I find these Hamburg records? They are part of an Ancestry subscription. And I wanted to show you an example here on the left about the Hamburg file. So this is an example of my third great grandfather. His name was Israel Bagel. And here he is arriving in New York City in 1886. I had no idea where the Bagel family was from until I found his record and a brother's record. And just an interesting side note about my family history, Israel's brother, he had a descendant who formed the Bagels Bakery in Brooklyn, which created the black and white cookie that's found in New York City. So it's all thanks to this family. Yeah. So anyways, they were from this town called Rupschitz in Galicia. So Hamburg, that's a really good one to focus on. The next one.
Apparently my great grandfather came from Hamburg.
Oh, you're in luck.
I just found it.
You're
An immigration statement.
amazing. Okay. You're doing research on the fly. Okay. Sometimes an inscription on a grave will include the community, or maybe like the community, the grave community of who was burying them. You'll actually know which town.
Society.
Exactly. The society, the burial society can also give you information. And then the last one, this is one that also I've utilized just on a couple of occasions. But if you have an ancestor who lived long enough to have a social security card, that means they had to have died after the 1930s when social security was allowed, they had to fill out a form where they had the social security number and it listed, they asked for the specific town of birth. And so for one of my ancestors, that was a big brick wall. I ordered this form. I have a little link in the presentation of how you can do it, how you can order the SS5 form for your ancestors, and it will list the town that ancestor came from.
You know, I'll just jump in here because I had some issues with birth certificates in my family. Sometimes, for example, they would have children and then they would get their marriage certificate. So they may have had 2 out of the 6 children already before that was there. So that the dates on the birth certificates are not always exactly maybe when they were going to be born. And sometimes they don't even exist. And that does happen in some parts of my family where there just is no birth certificate at all. They just didn't log it. So you may find that happens too, where you just may not be able to find it because it doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, exactly. We will get exactly into that. So let's go to the next slide. So once you've discovered your ancestral towns, again, these are the steps. You first have to get the names, and you should focus on the names in America first and try and get as many people who came to America. Then try and use those people to find out the towns. And then once you've figured out the towns, the next step is let's find records from these towns. And to your point, it is a myth that Jewish records in Europe were destroyed in the Holocaust. Okay, it's a myth, a total myth. There are a lot of records in Europe for little towns that still exist today. In fact, most of the destruction of records that I have found personally happened during World War I. Okay, when invading forces came from Russia and from Germany, went through Poland and went through Slovakia and Hungary and other places, a lot of records burned then, not in World War II. Okay, another example is the best document I have of my layman line was actually preserved by the Nazis. And there's a whole Nazi stamp on it. They were not into destroying records. They wanted to know who had Jewish ancestry so that they could exterminate them. But the extent of existing records and the state of the digitization of those records will vary by your locale. So to Elisa's point, it may or may not be possible to find records of your family in Europe, but in most cases, you can, okay? And so I don't want you to think that it's impossible. In most cases, you should be able to find records. So what we have here again is to consult the handout. We have a lot of websites for the specific regions that you're researching your family. And part of the challenge with records in Europe is that they are going to be in different languages if they're not just in England. Common languages that you'll find are German, French, Polish, Russian, Hebrew, Hungarian. And it's important to become familiar with basic terminology in these languages. Google Translate is going to be your friend. A lot of times you can copy and paste and be able to translate that way. There are definitely free translation services available too. There is a translation service on Facebook. If you are on Facebook, you can post a link to the file and people will translate it for you for free. And so there are easy ways to get files translated. And I just wanted to show you this example here of my wife's fourth great grandfather in Latvia, which was part of Russia. Those records were in Russian and in Hebrew. So it was actually pretty easy. If you read Hebrew, you can read the name in Hebrew pretty easily. You don't have to just read the Cyrillic.
And I'll also add, my family records are in Dutch, as I mentioned. But what's great about Dutch is that it kind of looks like the English. So sometimes you can look at it and try and figure out what it might be trying to say, and then try the translator, and if you need it. But they're pretty standard. They're going to list the dates, the birth, the father, the mother, right? So you're looking at words in different languages.
Yeah, I think Cyrillic is one of the hardest ones because it's not in Latin script. I have personally found that to be the hardest, but
No reference.
there are ways to get around it. It will take a little bit more time, but there are ways to navigate through that. All right, so I wanted to spend a slide here to talk about Europe's changing borders. When we talk about genealogy, you're talking about history and world history. And with world history, borders did not stay the same. And the countries that exist in Europe today are very different than how the world looked like just, going back to the 20th century, going back to the 19th century and beyond. So borders changed frequently. And I want to just highlight a few examples of that. So it's very important when you're researching your town to know which country it was in at that point in time, because they could be part of very different countries. So the best example of changing borders is modern day Poland. A lot of people are going to have ancestry from Poland. And beginning in 1772 and up until like the 1790s, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which had a lot of Jews, was split up between three different world powers. To the west, it was the German Empire of Prussia that took over western parts of Poland. So if you think about Poznan and other cities in western Poland, that went to Prussia. In the south, that was controlled by the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So if you think about places in Slovakia today, in Hungary, places in southern Poland like Galicia, those were all part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And then places in the eastern part, which included parts of eastern Poland, but over time, but more so in places called Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, Belarus, those all got controlled by the Russian Empire. And so it's important to know which countries these locales were in at that time. I have a couple other examples on the slide. whether it's Alsace, modern day Germany, or Subcarpathia, but you get the picture. There were a lot of changing borders throughout history, and it's important to know which country you're looking for records in.
So when you look in the country where that the 18th or 19th century geography is now, or when you look at where it was historically, and
That is a wonderful question, and that's actually not an easy question to answer.
We
So
could repeat it.
I'm going to repeat the question. The question is, so when you're looking for these records, are you going to be looking for like the old country, the new country? Who stores the records today? That's a great question. And it varies by locale. So most places are, if the state archives have digitized records, it'll be within the modern day country today. So for instance, if you are anywhere in Poland, in Warsaw, which was, or Eastern Poland, which was part of Russia, the Russian part, or in the southern part of Poland, which was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, there's the Polish State Archives website. They will have all those records digitized online, and you can use the one central Polish website. The same thing for Latvia, which has their records digitized. Lithuania does not, but you can get access to see excerpts of those records. Usually the state website will have information. So usually that's your first go-to place.
and most of these places have the English language interfaces.
It varies. Some do, some do not. Some have, there are websites that you can use, like I've linked to, like especially for Latvia, where you can easily figure out how to navigate the site because there's a whole tutorial of how to navigate the website that Jewish Gen put together.
And the way to check, just if anyone's unfamiliar, usually somewhere in the bar on the top, it'll say like English, French, German. You can like pick which language you'd like to.
You can also
the
do
website
Google
is.
Translate of a web page, and I highly recommend that too for navigating. Very good questions. All right, so now we're going to go on to the surname adoption barrier, and this is oftentimes the biggest hurdle. Once you've found your place, once you've found the records, we need to get past the surname adoption barrier. So what is this? So back, unlike the Christian population in Europe, most Jews living in Europe don't adopted surnames only in the last 200 to 250 years. It's a recent phenomenon. And the reason for that is that they weren't citizens before then. And for tax purposes, there were other ways that they would just tax the community. They wouldn't tax individual Jews. And so people back before having surnames, how were they named? They were called, X son of Y, and they would give the father's name, or X daughter of Y. If she was a girl, they would give the father's name. And it gets very hard when you only have first names to be able to trace back trees. So usually what we say is it requires a close analysis of the existing records, and you probably are only going to be able to take your records back a generation or two. On the left-hand side of the page, I do have just an example of what this looks like. So this is my 6th great-grandfather on the left. This is his death record from 1821. And it says here that it's Hershko Gedala, Hirsch, son of Gedala, okay? And in 1830, Hershko's father, Gedala, dies. Okay, so the father died after the son. Gedala dies, and Gedala has a last name in 1830. His name is Biederman. So between 1821 and 1830, this was in Eastern Poland, which was part of Russia, they adopted surnames, and the Biederman name was adopted. And before then, you can see they used the patronyms, and then afterwards, they used Biedermans.
Do you get any sense of where these adopted names came from? Like with the African Americans, it's very often the slave owner, but
This is also a great question. Where origins of last names came from. I'm most familiar with Polish surnames. A lot of them were Germanized because back in the 1790s, 1780s, which is when most of the surnames there were adopted, the Germans, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Austrian Empire was German, and they just gave Germanized names. So even if they didn't have any Germanized backgrounds, you would see a lot of German names. That's not the case for places in Russia, but for a lot of places in Poland, they have Germanized names because of that.
And many surnames are named after either the place that they lived, the community they lived, or the profession that they had.
Yes, they can. It can be profession, it can be the community, it can also be the patronym. So like I have seen surnames with the last name Hirsch. People took on the last name Hirsch because they had an ancestor named Hirsch, and they just adopted that as their last name. And you see that too. So there are exceptions to the surname adoption only being in the last 200, 250 years. And they're important ones. If you have ancestors that lived in larger cities, such as Prague, Frankfurt, or Metz, which is in France, you're in luck, because most of these places have, because they were big cities, people needed to have last names to be able to differentiate with each other. And so they adopted surnames much earlier. So if you have any ancestry from these cities, you're in luck. If you connect back to a rabbinic line, you're also very lucky, because rabbinic families adopted surnames at a much earlier point as part of the prestige and being able to signify their family. And there are also a lot of trees that exist for rabbinic lines. So if you're able to find that, you're also in luck and can take back your tree much earlier than just the last 200 plus years. And I want to spend now the last few slides here on DNA testing and genealogy research. I just want to see here in the room today, has anyone in this room taken a DNA test, whether through Ancestry? No one. I'm not seeing anyone raise their hands here. That's good, because hopefully I can convince you of the merit of doing such testing, because it is what I believe to be a core component now of genealogy research, is incorporating DNA testing. It is extremely helpful. So just as an example, I've been able to find numerous new branches of the family thanks solely to DNA testing. And I have hundreds of DNA matches that I now have on my tree. Hundreds of people who I found through DNA testing. Now, DNA testing has only become commercialized in the past decade. That's also something that's really important. This is new. It's a new technology, and there are ethics involved in it too, and that can be a point of contention. But it is now a core feature of genealogy research. If you really want to be able to research your family, DNA is an amazing tool.
Downsides.
Yes, there are downsides. So there are some important downsides. One is that be aware that about 10% of people who take a DNA test will find that either in their own family, their own ancestry, or in some close family member's ancestry, they will have what's called misattributed paternity, or what we also say misattributed parentage, where they think that someone's father is their father and it's actually not their biological father. I'll give an example, a personal example. My wife took a DNA test, a few years ago, and she found out through her DNA test that her father had 2 half siblings that he never knew about. And they've all connected, and it's been a good reunion and learning about this, but it happens. 10% is a lot of people. There are millions of people who find this when they take a DNA test.
Let me ask you a question. It's much worthwhile for me. My maternal grandmother died when my mother was 16. She was very quickly disowned her father. He had no interest in his children. I never met him. He died when I was in high school. I haven't really been able to figure out exactly where he wound up. Joseph Zager, not entirely sure. But I'm told he remarried and had children. So I might be able to actually.
You would very much be able to find them. You would be able to find those families, very, very likely.
Assuming they've been turned.
Yeah, so what I would say so he's asking, like, I have family members who I don't, a grandfather I fell out of touch with, and I heard he remarried and had kids. Could DNA testing find these cousins? And I'm going to say there's a very good chance that you would. Most people have taken DNA tests. There's at least someone in the family, in that close family, who's taken a DNA test. At this point, there's a huge database of testers at this point. I'm telling you, I could run a few episodes of it in my own family.
DNA test, what do you get?
So we'll get into it. This is sort of just an overview slide of it. But yes, it can lead to a lot of surprises. It's very important to know that. What I will say also is that all of these websites where you take a DNA test, law enforcement are forbidden from accessing. Okay, so for a lot of obvious purposes, for commercial purposes, these companies do not want to be involved with law enforcement because it would kill their business of selling DNA kits. So if you trust them, they are not going to be able to do that. But I will also say is that even if you do not take a DNA test, people will be able to find you in your family, unfortunately, because other people in your family probably have taken a DNA test, and you're going to be found regardless. We'll get to that.
The other thing I just want to warn here, it's maybe a little bit unclear, so you should do the research really for yourself, are any third parties that are associated with the DNA test, because while they may not be able to get your DNA, they may have access to your connections and who you're connected to in your family. They may. Those are really getting into those privacy contracts that they put on the website. Those are questions you may want to ask.
Yeah, there's definitely a trade-off in general with just genealogy research and putting things online and privacy.
Yes.
And the same thing with DNA. There is a trade-off with that. But in my personal experience, it has been well worth it to have the DNA test. I just have like a
And you
million
can delete it.
examples.
You can delete it if you choose.
Okay, so I wanted to just briefly describe two different types of DNA testing. We're going to really talk about autosomal, but I wanted to talk about Y-DNA too, because it's the older form of DNA testing that's existed for actually more than 20 years. And it can be very useful in genealogy research, but it's usually not your first test that you take. So what is a Y-DNA test? It looks solely at your paternal line, and you have to be a male to take it because it looks at your Y chromosome, and only males have Y chromosomes. It's a very narrow test. It only looks at your father's line. Okay, so if I took it, which I've taken one, it looks just at my layman line, going back thousands of years. What the Y-DNA test is able to do is look at migration patterns over really long periods of time. And really over the next 10 or 15 years, our knowledge of just Jewish history is going to get transformed by people all over the world taking Y-DNA tests. Already, we know so much more about Jewish history. For instance, we know that most of the lines, the male lines in Europe, were from the Middle East, actually. The Jewish lines actually originated in the Middle East and have no European connection outside of the last 1,000 years. So something that you can do if you're a male and you want to take that test. It's interesting. It's less useful for finding genealogy relationships, but it can be used in that way. The second one is autosomal DNA. And that's the one that is what I usually refer to when taking a DNA test. It looks at the 22 pairs of autosomes, which are inherited from both of your parents. And so what you're doing is you're seeing 50% of your DNA from each parent. You're seeing 25% of the DNA inherited from each grandparent. You're seeing 12.5% inherited from each great-grandparent. But you can see here is that as you get further and further back in time, the percentage of DNA that you inherited from that ancestor gets smaller and smaller. And so once you get beyond 200 to 400 years, it becomes completely diluted. You can't see any of those ancestors in your DNA today in autosomal. And so what I like to say about autosomal DNA testing, it's a broad reach. You can see all lines of your ancestry, but you're limited to only the last 200, 300 so odd years. If you try and find ancestry beyond that, your autosomal is not going to be helpful. So autosomal DNA is the preferred mode of testing. You get to see all your lines of ancestry. You will be able to find cousins you probably have never found and find new lines. That's the best way to do it. So DNA tips, and this is about autosomal DNA tips. The first one is do autosomal DNA if you're going to do tests. It's the best bang for your buck. Which testing provider should I do? I say do Ancestry or 23andMe. I recommend those Ancestry because Ancestry has the biggest database, especially if you have American family members. If your family's been here for at least 80 plus odd years, you're going to find family on Ancestry. It has the largest database, but you can also do 23andMe. The other thing to do here is if you are of a younger generation, test your relatives who are older if you're able to. That includes direct ancestors such as your parents or grandparents. For me, I've only tested my father, but I've tested my 3 living grandparents, and I've been able to find so many lines from them. Typically, when you take your own DNA test, you'll be able to find cousins very easily up through 3rd cousins. So I'm finding my grandparents' 3rd cousins, I'm finding my generation 5th cousins. Okay, that's very far back in time.
When you say you find a cousin, what do you find?
We'll get to that. That'll be the last slide here. So after you have people tested, the other thing you can do is if you test on Ancestry or 23andMe, you can upload your DNA results to other websites to see other testers too. So if you want to try and expand your list of DNA matches, you can upload to MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA. There are a few other ones. There's also a very good third-party website called GEDmatch, which is the best one for analyzing matches. And this will allow you to see a lot of different testing pools and to compare your DNA to lots of different people who have taken DNA tests. MyHeritage is really good for Europeans and Israelis. So those people usually have taken tests on MyHeritage. If you want to be able to compare with those folks, you should go and upload your test from Ancestry or 23andMe to MyHeritage.
No, when you say European old or new?
Today, modern day population. If you have cousins who live in France or England or Germany, they're most likely to have tested with MyHeritage.
So within group of siblings, only one would need to do it, right?
So yes, for siblings, one can do it. It's a complicated question because if you get 3 siblings to test, you can work magic. And there's a really, really amazing thing you can do where you can it takes some work, but you can parse out all of your DNA to each of the siblings' grandparents. So if you have 3 surviving siblings, I don't have it in this presentation. I can show it to you offline after the presentation is over. I'll show you an example of it, but it's extremely valuable tool. If you can get 3 siblings to test, you can do a lot of analysis based off of that. But typically, yes, you should just try and focus people who are your direct ancestors, people who are of the older generations, and include yourself. Sorry. And then here, so what you get, I didn't actually list a example of what your match list looks like, but what you'll do is when you take a test, you're going to get a whole list of your matches and it'll get sorted from the highest number. It's called centimorgans. That's the unit of measure that's used to measure amount of DNA. And you'll see your biggest matches to your smallest matches. Ancestry, you'll have probably 200,000 matches. If you're Ashkenazi Jewish 100%, you'll have a lot. But one of the key things is how do I figure out what's a good match and what's not a good match? So the highest overall number of centimorgans are going to be the most important matches. So what I always say is if you have a total match over 200 centimorgans, that's traceable. You should be able to find out how that person's related to you. 200 or more, you're good. Especially if what you'll have is 2 certain criteria: the total amount of shared DNA and the longest segment length. If the longest segment length is over 20 and the total amount is over 200, that's traceable. That's very traceable, and you should be able to find out how you're connected. And I'll just end and say that Jewish endogamy, so the Jewish population married in with each other for hundreds and hundreds of years. It means that almost every person with Jewish ancestry is going to match with like any other Jew on a site, but just very minimal amounts. So that can play around a little bit with the matching algorithms. So just be aware of that. But if you follow my rule of thumb of looking for people who have over 200 and the longest segment over 20, you should be able to find out how you're connected to them.
This slide, where would you?
So this on the left-hand side here, you can see what the number of centimorgans are for certain relationships. So if let's say you test me and my father, okay, my father on average will have about 3,495 centimorgans in common with me. And this is the range that it could fall in. It could be as low as 2,000, I can't read this number, 376 and 3,729. That is the range for a parent. But so if you see a number that's less than that, that's not your parent. Okay, if you tested your parent and you're not seeing that, then that's not your parent. Or same vice versa for a cousin, right? Let's say you're looking at your first cousin and it's less than 396. Well, maybe it's not a full first cousin. Maybe it's a half first cousin, right? Which is on this side over here. So this is a helpful tool. It's called the Share CM project tool. There's a link in the presentation where you can see that, where you can easily compare your matches. You just type in the number and it'll give you the probabilities of how you're connected to that person. You can type in a number on this website. All right, we're running a little bit off on time. So I wanted to close here and just thank everyone. Hopefully people found this informative.
I think, if you didn't mention, maybe it's here. We did it at the Milstein room at the library, 42nd Street Library. They've endowed, the Milstein have endowed a room this large. They give you ancestry, they give you a computer.
So I have the New York Public Library website because there's in the handout, because you can do things online too, digital. Yeah. Okay, and with that, maybe we can take some questions from folks. We got a few minutes here. Maybe we can ask people to unmute.
End the show.
Okay.
And then, you wanna-
Stop the screen share. Okay.
yep, and then you want to look here in the chat.
Oh, in the chat.
And see if anyone posted questions.
Okay, we can go through questions too. Could you leave handouts at the synagogue to pick up by those online?
Yes.
Okay. Genealogy worksheet. Okay, I think we got everything posted. Does anyone have any questions about this? Thank you for everyone who stayed online.
Quick question. I did not see the handout in the chat. Was that included?
Yeah, let me link it again.
I can repost it, yeah.
Okay,
It's in
Shira's
there.
gonna
Yeah.
repost it for you, Ori.
Yep.
Yeah, so you can download both the worksheet and the presentation.
And we will also leave copies here, hard copies at the shul. We'll leave them in the office and you are welcome to pick them up.
Yes, for those who are stopping by the shul, they can pick it up too.
I have a question.
Okay, we got a question.
Let's say you've got a tremendous amount of information in genie.com.
Yes.
How do you get that out of there and into something else?
There's a button on there that says export GEDCOM.
I think you're right.
Let's
So,
repeat for the people.
okay, so there's another website called genie.com, which I didn't reference specifically in this presentation. It's the website is actually trying to create one tree where everyone in the world is connected. It's a great website if you have if you want to connect with distant famous ancestors, for instance, like I know how I'm connected to how I'm cousins with Felix Mendelssohn, the composer, or
I'm related to someone famous.
Oh, you are?
Oh,
So
yeah.
you could find that on Genie.
I could, but I already know
Oh.
that Tom Hiddleston's my cousin.
Oh, okay. Or like Julia Louis-Dreyfus is a cousin. You can find out exactly how you're connected.
Curious because they're doing that.
So let me just answer her question, and then we'll answer a couple questions here. So Leah Warren Klein's question was how to do that. I think you can export using a GEDCOM. I have not done that in the past. So what I've done is I simultaneously try and maintain Genie and an online web tree. It's a lot of work,
A lot of work.
but Genie is really fun.
If you can export using.
Then you can put it straight onto Ancestry. If you get a GEDCOM file, it's very easy.
Straight into.
If it's able to do that, yeah. You might have to specify like only the descendants of so-and-so to get your GEDCOM, because a whole Genie tree, you're not going to be able to get onto Ancestry. It's too many people. All right, your question is the cost?
And a question came in on the chat. And a question came in on the
Okay, so
chat.
maybe let's do the chat question and then we'll take the question from the audience here. Have you found conflicting information between these websites? That is a great question. Yeah, you can. And different records actually, so this is part of doing your sleuthing, is, people like, for instance, on census records, they either lied about their age or they got their age wrong, and there's inconsistencies of their birth dates. What I found sometimes is that their date of birth is actually off. When I find the actual birth record is off by a month, guess what? They were using the Hebrew date, and one was a leap year and one wasn't. Sometimes that's actually the issue. So you can have some inconsistencies where things like that come up. And what I will always say is use the earliest records as the most authoritative, right? So the birth records are going to have most likely when the person was born. On their grave, if they died at age 80 and they actually were 75 on the birth record, well, guess what? They were actually 75. The people who, put the inscription on the grave got the age wrong. Use the earliest known records. And yes, you might find some conflicting things, but usually the core of the evidence will lean in one direction, and use the older records as proof. The next question was cost for DNA tests. So Ancestry's cost in general is around $99. They sometimes put it on sale for as low as $59. For $60, it's not a lot of money for what you can find. That's all I will say, is that it's well worth it for that. An Ancestry subscription is more expensive. So it's a periodical subscription. You can do it you can get a free trial, but after that free trial, you'll have to enroll for a few months, and it could be you could do it for 6 months to a year. And typically I ended up paying about $300 a year for an Ancestry subscription for everything that I need, which is a lot. So there are tiers, so it doesn't have to be that expensive. But for me, I'm researching every day. It's very useful for me to be, I'm getting the value for it. And then you can stop if you want to. Your tree, everything that's on your tree still remains. So even if you stop paying for the subscription, you'll still have your tree. The tree doesn't go away. So if they're Ancestry specific records that are linked to your tree, If you do not have a subscription, you will not be able to see them. You'll see them linked to your tree, but you won't be able to open them. So there are ways around that. If you want to, you can download the file, and then re-upload. And then once anything you upload is yours.
So there's a comment and a question in the chat.
Okay. I'm finding that Jeannie tries to control your tree. Just be careful.
Yeah,
It's,
a lot.
yeah, there's a lot of policing. There is a lot of policing when it's one tree. Yes. And so that's why I like to have my own tree. Phyllis, that's a great point. The next question is, I found on Ancestry, they have my birth date off by a year. Is that correctable? So that's another thing that is a downside of public trees, is that either you're finding it in records, but more oftentimes in trees, there are other people that have wrong information. I cannot tell you, like, I've been researching my wife's Rubin family. It's a very common surname, very hard to research. And every tree, there are 25 trees online. They all said it's from Odessa, Ukraine, Odessa, Ukraine, Odessa, Ukraine. Guess what? That couldn't be further from the truth. They were from somewhere else in the Russian Empire, in Belarus, many hundreds of miles away, in a totally small town, very far away from Odessa. But so many people had copied one mistake, it spread and proliferated. So one of the things that I always say is that when you look at other people's trees, try as much as you can to verify it yourself, because you don't want to be, spreading misinformation in your tree as well. So try and do that, because that is something that can happen. If it's on one tree, it could be that it's on lots of other trees. If it's in a record that they're finding, it could be that the record just mistakenly had your birth date off by a year, and or maybe it's using an estimated year, and it just estimated a year, and people assume that was the actual year of birth. Like for yearbooks, oftentimes they'll give you an estimated, because they're like, oh, they're in high school, so like they must be born around this year. But then people think they're born actually in 1964 when they were born in 1965, that type of thing.
So to answer Hedda's question, is it correctable if she recognizes that her own record is wrong? Can she contact them, or is anything to be done?
That's a great question. I don't know. It depends on where, again, it depends on the source. If it's a family tree, you contact the person heading the family tree and say, hey, you've got me in my family tree. Usually people who are living are private. You can't see living people on any one person's tree. So it's most likely she's seeing this on an actual record.
Can
But
I
you
just
can,
interrupt you? Excuse me.
yes.
I'm Hedda Silverstein.
Hi.
I had it for 2 weeks free, and I was going to do footstones in Hebrew. And I went on looking for my great-grandparent, my great-grandmother's, my great-grandfather's name. And I saw the whole tree, my tree, I don't know who put it on, and it was off. It gave me I was a year younger on there instead of the
Okay, so you
actual
actually
date.
saw yourself on that tree. So you should
Yeah, I
contact the
saw
tree
the
owner.
tree. Pardon? No,
You
this
can
was just
contact
the
the
tree
tree
of my
owner and send a
parents.
message to them.
Excuse me? I'm sorry.
Just like, go ahead.
No, I don't know how that I had the tree, or maybe I put it, I don't know how it happened. But, it took me a while to find my great-grandparents' name, and then I called a cousin. But my date of my birth was wrong.
So yes, but so you also always want to contact the tree owner and tell them that there's an error. If it's on your own tree that you had the error and that's how it proliferated, you can fix your own tree. If you're
No,
finding
I didn't do it. This is when I first went
yeah, so
on. I don't know
you
who
contact the tree owner.
Who's
So
the tree owner?
usually they have a username associated with the tree, and you can click on that and then you can send a message. It's usually pretty easy to find the tree owner that had that issue. It's probably not a record then. It's probably from a tree. Yes, Rhonda has a great point. There's a website, it's in the handout. Findagrave.com is very good for finding graves. And yes, graves.me is also one for Israel. That's also on the handout. Thank you, Phyllis. Those are great. Finding graves is really important. And photos of those graves are really important. Yes.
You haven't found any scheming in this world in terms of people finding people that they shouldn't be, things that they shouldn't be doing. We got a call about 7 years ago from a woman in Ohio. She said she has a tree of my grandmother's family. It turned out she was honest and it was right. She was just doing this as a hobby. So
Yeah.
she was looking at third parties just as a hobby.
Yeah.
Have you heard of any cases where
Nefarious purposes? Okay, so the question is like, have I found any use cases of trees or of whatnot where people are trying to scam others when they connect? So maybe Eliza should answer it first. I have not personally experienced that, but it's important to be skeptical. It's also one of the points that's very difficult for me because, you know, I'm coming usually with very good intentions and trying to connect, and I have to sort of prove myself. And I have to usually provide some details about myself and just provide some vulnerability and be like, hey, look, you know, here's my tree. You can see like who I am, and, you know, so that people can trust me. And it is important to be skeptical. And now Elisa
And
can,
we do, somebody contacted, actually, I have a cousin in Connecticut, and her and I are very close, and we do a lot of genealogy work together. And somebody contacted her claiming they were a cousin in Massachusetts. And we had all set up to meet, and then something didn't feel right about it. So what she was able to do is we actually went on to the ancestry, and we were doing some research, and we realized that when we traced this person's name, the line just didn't overlap enough with our family for us to think that it made sense. So we ended up not meeting that person together. But we were going to like go out for lunch. We didn't meet them in the end. And we've actually just stopped talking to them because we're not positive. They haven't offered us any, like as Jeremy said, if they really are genuine and want to connect, they're going to offer you some personal information so that you can verify before you have that meeting, which is what happened with another cousin that we met in Norwalk. She was lovely in her 80s, and we actually met her, and she was honest doing some research. We were able to connect and verify that she was part of our tree before we met.
Because I guess there were people doing it as a hobby, not only for themselves.
That's right.
This woman was doing it for a number of people that her family knew in Europe.
yeah,
She had all the
there are
information.
lots of trees like that. Actually, yeah, like there are people who are really interested in just building out like specific shtetls and finding all of the people who live there. And I've actually helped collaborate with a number of these shtetls, trees, to put in my family members in there. So it is very important.
Last question, see if you
yes.
can spell the name where my grandmother came from. Mezbech, I don't think there's a vowel in it.
I know where it is. It's in Ukraine. Baal Shem Tov. I've been there. I've spent a few nights there. I've visited the community.
There's a vowel in the neighborhood.
It is, but that's in Western Ukraine. Yep.
Should I contact the cemetery or the burial committee information to get more? This was behind about 4 different graves and climbing over. I just found that.
Yes, you should try and contact
Through
them.
the
Which cemetery is it?
Old Montefiore, I guess it is.
You should contact them. Yeah, because I don't think you can search that one online. Sometimes there's some cemeteries in the New York area you can actually research and find out the burial society just by researching online. Yeah, so but not for the Old Montefiore.
Okay.
Do you think Jewish cemeteries in the US have been at their graves?
It's a great question. So the question is, to what extent have you cemeteries in the US become digitized, their photos, Jewish cemeteries? There's been a concerted effort to do that. There are a lot of Jews who are interested in Jewish genealogy, and part of the effort is to try and take photos of these graves, both in the US and in Europe. You know, if you can find graves of your ancestors in Europe, it's amazing. I cannot tell you, I've had some of the biggest discoveries from finding the inscriptions of graves of my ancestors in Europe too. But in the US, it's going to vary. New York City area, it's pretty good, but there's still a lot of, it depends on the cemetery. Some cemeteries are like fully photographed, others are not at all, and it depends. But if you get in contact with the cemetery, you can also, there are people who are willing to travel out to a cemetery and take a photo for you. I'm actually having someone do that for me in Pittsburgh this week. They're going to go out to a cemetery that's hard to access, and they're going to take a photo of my wife's second great grandparents. So
I have photos of 3 of my grandparents and all of my grandparents, I think, but I'm wondering if
they're better quality photos, you're saying?
Be better quality photo than what I took.
You might. It's always worth searching. Find a grave and some of these other websites.
Shadows and stuff, it's something you can't really-
Correct. Correct.
Okay, I just want to say thank you everyone for coming out tonight. This was really
Yes.
fun.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you
Thank
for
you for
coming.
sticking with us for the full hour plus. Yeah, I think we'll end it here. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you both so much.
All right. Take care, guys.
Bye-bye.